Don't blink, darling. I want the world to see what happens when a nobody tries to sit at the grown-ups' table. Julian Sterling's voice was a jagged blade wrapped in silk as he tilted the crystal glass. Elara Vance stood frozen in the center of the Grand Horizon ballroom, her breath hitching as a stream of dark, expensive liquid began to cascade over her head. It felt cold and thick as it drenched her blonde waves, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room's golden light. The liquid soaked into her sparkling blue gown, turning the shimmering fabric into a heavy, ruined mess that clung to her skin like a second, shameful skin. Julian's smirk was triumphant, his eyes bright with the thrill of a predator who knew no one would dare pull his leash. Around them, the elite of the city, men in $5,000 tuxedos and women draped in heritage jewels, did not move to help. Instead, they raised their phones like a digital firing squad, the flashes of their cameras strobing against the ballroom's ornate white and gold walls. "Oh, Julian, honey, you've done it now," Beatrice Sterling cooed, stepping closer while keeping her camera perfectly leveled at Elara's dripping face. She was looking a bit too proud of that little software company of hers. Now she just looks damp. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. And Happy New Year to every single one of you. Let's start this year with a story that will keep you glued till the very end. Alastair Sterling, the patriarch whose name was etched into the very foundations of the city's skyline, approached with the slow, heavy gait of a king. He didn't look at Elara as a person, he looked at her as a stain on his expensive reality. "Do try not to ruin the upholstery on your way out," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioning. "This gala is for contributors to society, not for charity cases who think a few lines of code make them our equals." Elara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, the liquid still pattering onto the marble floor, her eyes fixed on Julian with a terrifying, silent focus. To the crowd, she was just a tech startup founder being put in her place by old money. They saw a victim. They saw a girl whose decade of hard work was being washed away by a single glass of spite. None of them understood that they had just humiliated the only daughter of Dominic the Ghost Moretti, a man whose name was never spoken above a whisper in the halls of power. While the Sterlings built their empire on high-interest loans and political favors, Dominic Moretti had built his on the terrifying efficiency of a shadow network that reached into every corner of the globe. He was a man who lived by a singular, ancient code: disrespect is a debt that must be settled in full. The crystal chandeliers overhead, imported from the finest workshops in Europe, cast dancing shadows that suddenly seemed much longer and sharper. Only moments ago, Elara had entered this room as the guest of honor, a rising star in the tech world whose firm, Aegis Software, was being scouted by global investors. She had moved through the crowd with a quiet, practiced elegance, her blue gown catching the light like the surface of a deep ocean. At 30, she was a woman of presence and intellect, someone who had painstakingly scrubbed the Moretti name from her biography to build an identity based on merit rather than fear. She had spent 10 years running from the shadow of the ghost, trying to prove that a girl born in the dark could thrive in the light. She wanted to be legitimate. She wanted to be clean. She wanted a world where the rules mattered. But as Julian Sterling laughed and the crowd recorded her shame, Elara felt the fragile structure of her legitimate life begin to crack. The rules of the light had failed her. The Sterlings didn't play by them, and the guests in this room were only too happy to watch them break a nobody. As she turned to leave, the blue fabric of her dress heavy and cold against her legs, a few guests with connections to the deeper, darker currents of the city noticed something the Sterlings had missed. They didn't see a broken girl. They saw the way her spine remained perfectly straight. They saw the cold, calculating stillness in her eyes, a look they had only ever seen on one other person. Somewhere in the silence that followed her exit, a veteran reporter lowered his camera, his hands suddenly shaking. He knew the ghost. And he knew that the Sterlings hadn't just poured a drink on a tech CEO, they had just declared war on a man who never lost. Elara watched the city lights blur through the window of the rideshare, her reflection in the glass still marked by a single, drying streak of wine on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. To do so would be to acknowledge the sting of Julian Sterling's laughter, and Elara had spent too long hardening her heart to let a spoiled heir see her flinch. She had spent the last decade meticulously crafting Elara Vance, the self-made tech prodigy whose name appeared on patent filings and Forbes lists, a woman whose foundation was built on logic, code, and midnight oil. But as the car turned toward the shadowed outskirts of the city, the Vance persona began to feel like a thin silk veil being shredded by the wind. The car stopped at a nondescript industrial loft. To the world, this was a textile import office. To Elara, it was the entrance to the only world she had ever truly belonged to, no matter how hard she tried to resign. She stepped out, her blue gown ruined and heavy, and walked toward the private elevator. The security guard, a man whose neck was thick with old scars, didn't ask for identification. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of deep, ancestral respect that no legitimate CEO ever received. As the elevator rose to the penthouse, Elara felt the weight of her lineage settle onto her shoulders like a leaden cloak. She wasn't just a victim of a gala prank, she was the daughter of Dominic the Ghost Moretti, the silent architect of the city's underground. Growing up, she hadn't seen him as a monster, but as a force of nature, a man who moved through life with the absolute certainty that he was the apex predator. He had taught her that power wasn't just about what you owned, but what you could take, and more importantly, what you could protect. The doors opened to a room that smelled of cedar and expensive tobacco. Dominic sat behind a desk of dark, polished mahogany, his silhouette framed by a panoramic view of the skyline he had spent 40 years subverting. He didn't turn around immediately. He was watching a silent feed on a monitor, the viral video of Julian Sterling pouring the Bordeaux over his daughter's head. He chose a 2015 Bordeaux, Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. A vintage that prides itself on complexity. Too bad the boy has none. Dominic turned his chair. His eyes, the same piercing gray as Elara's, assessed the wreckage of her gown. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cold, simmering calculation that made the air in the room feel thin. 10 years, Elara. You built a wall of glass and called it an empire. You thought if you played by their rules, they would treat you as an equal. I wanted to be different, Papa, Elara whispered, the first crack appearing in her composure. I wanted to build something that didn't require blood to sustain it. Dominic stood, walking toward her with the silent grace that had earned him his moniker. He reached out, his thumb finally wiping the wine stain from her cheek. The world doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about your strength. The Sterlings think you are a lamb because you chose to live in their pasture. They don't realize you were raised in the wolf's den. Elara looked into her father's eyes and saw the ghost staring back, a man who had built the Moretti syndicate on the unbreakable rule that every insult carried a price that had to be paid in full. For a decade, she had tried to be Elara Vance, the woman who believed in the law. But as she stood in the heart of her father's shadow, surrounded by maps of territories and whispers of power, she realized the law was a luxury the Sterlings had just revoked. She wasn't just a tech entrepreneur anymore. She was a Moretti, and the debt was about to be collected. By the next morning, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. Elara stood before the towering glass facade of the city's most prestigious legal firm, her reflection looking nothing like the wine-soaked victim from the night before. She wore a charcoal suit tailored with military precision, her blonde hair pulled back into a knot so tight it felt like armor. She was Elara Vance again, the woman who believed in the system, the woman who believed that a signed affidavit was more powerful than a silenced pistol. She stepped into the lobby of Sterling and Associates, the irony of the name not lost on her. She had been a client here for years, paying exorbitant retainers to ensure her startup remained beyond reproach. But as she approached the mahogany reception desk, the warm smiles she usually received were absent. The receptionist, a woman who had previously sent Elara holiday cards, didn't even look up from her monitor. "I'm here to see Marcus Thorne," Elara said, her voice steady. "We have a 10 o'clock. Mr. Thorne is in permanent meetings for the foreseeable future, Miss Vance," the woman replied, her tone as clinical as a surgical strike. "Your files have been boxed and sent to your home address. The firm is exercising its right to terminate representation, effective immediately." Elara felt the first chill of the glass wall her father had warned her about. "On what grounds?" "I was assaulted in public by a member of the family that shares a name with this building. If anything, there's a conflict of interest they should be addressing, not me." "The grounds are of misalignment of values," the receptionist said, finally looking up with eyes that held a flicker of genuine pity before turning back to stone. "I suggest you leave before security is called." Elara didn't argue. She turned on her heel and headed straight for the 14th precinct. If the lawyers were cowards, the police would have to be better. Justice wasn't a corporate luxury, it was a civic right. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. Elara waited for 3 hours on a hard plastic chair before she was called to a scarred wooden desk by a Detective Miller. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply stared at the tablet in front of him, which was playing a looped, edited version of the gala video, one where the audio was stripped, making Julian's assault look like an accidental stumble. "I want to file a formal report for third-degree assault and harassment," Elara stated, laying her own phone on the desk with the unedited footage ready. Miller sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "Look, Miss Vance, we've seen the footage. It looks like a party mishap. A clumsy error and an expensive dry-cleaning bill. Not exactly a felony. He targeted me. He humiliated me while his parents filmed it to destroy my professional reputation," she countered, her voice dropping an octave. "That is intent. That is a crime." Miller leaned forward, the light of the overhead fluorescents reflecting off his badge. "Here's the reality of the situation. The Sterlings donate more to the pension fund in a year than you'll make in a lifetime. The witnesses at that party? They've all signed statements saying they saw nothing but an accident. Even the waitstaff has suddenly developed collective amnesia." He slid her phone back toward her. "The DA won't touch this. My captain won't touch this. And if you're smart, you'll stop touching it too." Elara picked up her phone. The glass wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a mirror. Everywhere she turned, the legitimate world was showing her its true face, a face that looked remarkably like the one she had seen in her father's office. It was a world where the law was a tool for the powerful and a cage for the rest. She walked out of the precinct into the bright afternoon sun, the noise of the city feeling like a distant roar. She had tried the light. She had followed the rules. But the Sterlings had bought the sun, and they were using it to burn her alive. As she reached into her bag, her fingers didn't find her lawyer's card. They found the heavy, embossed coin her father had given her years ago. The rules had failed. It was time for the ghost. The sun had barely begun to set when the world Elara had spent 10 years building began to scream. She was in the heart of Aegis Software's glass-walled headquarters, reviewing a decryption algorithm, when the rhythmic thud of heavy boots shattered the office's focused silence. The lobby's reinforced glass doors didn't just open, they were breached. Federal agents. Nobody move. Hands where we can see them. The command echoed through the open-plan office, a harsh, metallic bark that silenced the hum of servers and the clicking of keyboards. Elara stood slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched in a state of suspended disbelief as 24 agents in tactical vests, emblazoned with FBI in stark white letters, swarmed the floor. They didn't move with the hesitation of men seeking information. They moved with the predatory efficiency of men executing a kill order. "I'm Elara Vance, the CEO," she said, her voice projecting a calm she didn't feel. "May I see a warrant?" A man with a face like weathered granite stepped forward, tossing a thick folder onto her glass desk. "Agent Miller, the same name as the detective at the precinct," she noted with a sickening jolt of realization, didn't wait for her to pick it up. "We're not here for a chat, Miss Vance. Or should I say, Miss Moretti?" The use of her father's name was like a physical blow. A few of her lead developers, young men and women who had looked up to her as a mentor, glanced at each other with widening eyes. The whispers started instantly, a soft hiss of doubt that filled the room. "This is a search and seizure warrant," Miller continued, his voice loud enough to ensure every employee heard. "We have credible testimony and encrypted logs indicating that Aegis Software isn't a tech startup. It's a sophisticated laundering front for the Moretti Syndicate's offshore racketeering. Every server, every laptop, and every line of code is now federal property." "That's a lie," Elara snapped, her composure finally fraying. "Check our ledgers. Check our venture capital sources. Everything is transparent." "Transparent?" Miller laughed, a short, ugly sound. "We have a whistleblower from the Sterling Foundation who provided the keys to your backdoor accounts. Accounts linked directly to Moretti-controlled banks in the Caymans. It seems you've been using your fancy encryption to hide more than just user data." As he spoke, agents began sweeping equipment off desks. One agent used a heavy maglite to smash the casing of a server rack, while others shoved Elara's staff toward the exits. The sound of high-end technology being tossed into plastic bins was the sound of her life being dismantled. The Sterlings hadn't just bought the local police, they had reached higher, using their political capital to turn the federal government into their personal wrecking crew. "You're being labeled a mafia money launderer, Elara," Miller whispered, leaning in close enough that she could smell the peppermint on his breath. "The news trucks are already downstairs. By tomorrow morning, your stock will be worthless, your investors will be gone, and your name will be radioactive. The Sterlings wanted you to know that they don't just pour drinks. They pour concrete." He didn't arrest her. That was the cruelest part. They left her standing in the middle of her empty, ransacked office, surrounded by the ghosts of her ambition. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the Sterling Tower across the street. She saw the news cameras positioned on the sidewalk, waiting to broadcast the image of the fallen mafia princess to a world that loved a scandal. The Sterlings had played their hand. They had stripped her of her legitimacy, her company, and her reputation in a single, coordinated strike. They had forced her back into the one identity she had fought a lifetime to escape. Elara reached into her pocket and gripped the Moretti coin until the metal bit into her palm. She didn't look at the news cameras. She didn't look at the ruin of her office. She looked toward the dark, industrial edge of the city where the ghost was waiting. The glass wall was gone. The rules of the light were dead. And the Sterlings were about to find out what happened when you pushed a Moretti into the dark. The industrial elevator ascended in a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Elara stood alone, her reflection in the polished steel doors unrecognizable. The fallen tech princess the news cycles were currently devouring looked pale, but her eyes had hardened into chips of gray flint. When the door slid open, she didn't find a dusty warehouse, she stepped into a world of quiet, terrifying efficiency. The Moretti stronghold was a masterpiece of surveillance and shadows. Men in sharp, dark suits moved with the silent discipline of ghosts, their eyes scanning monitors that bypassed the city's public firewalls as if they didn't exist. Dominic Moretti was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, looking out at the city lights as if they were pieces on a chessboard. "They took everything, Papa," Elara said, her voice echoing off the minimalist stone walls. "The servers, the patents, the reputation. They even took the name I spent 10 years making respectable." Dominic turned slowly. He didn't look surprised or angry, he looked like a man watching a predictable storm. "They didn't take them, Elara. They merely showed you that you never truly possessed them. In their world, ownership is a suggestion. In mine, it is an absolute." He walked toward a central glass table and tapped a hidden sensor. A holographic interface shimmered into existence, displaying a tangled web of the Sterling family's global holdings. "I have the men to make the Sterlings vanish by morning," Dominic said softly, the threat hanging in the air like a cold mist. "I have the means to burn their towers and salt the earth where they stood. You only have to ask." Elara looked at the glowing web of the Sterling's empire. The temptation to let the ghost loose, to watch Julian's arrogance crumble into raw terror, was a physical ache in her chest. But then she thought of the young coders at Aegis, the families who relied on her technology, and the 10 years she had spent proving that a Moretti could be a builder instead of a destroyer. "No," Elara said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. "If I let you kill them, they win. They'll have proven that I'm exactly what they labeled me, a mafia princess who can't survive without a gun. I want them ruined, but I want them ruined by the very truth they think they buried." Dominic arched an eyebrow, a glimmer of intrigue crossing his weathered features. "Truth is a fickle weapon, Elara. It requires a theater that hasn't been bought." "Then we'll build our own theater," she countered, stepping up to the table. "I want your network. I want your ghost protocols, the surveillance, the deep-dive forensics, the back-alley whispers. But I will not use them for hits or bribes. I am going to use the Moretti Syndicate to find the one thing the Sterlings are most afraid of, legally admissible evidence. I'm going to find the crimes they couldn't pay to erase and deliver them to the only people they can't buy." Dominic studied her for a long moment. He saw the fire of her ambition tempered by the ice of her resolve. He saw a Moretti who had finally found her own way to answer disrespect. "The ghost protocols are yours," he said, tapping a final command on the table. A small, black encrypted drive slid out from a concealed slot. "But be warned, Elara. Once you look into the abyss of how the Sterlings truly built their wealth, there is no going back to the girl who believed in fair play. You are entering the shadow to save the light." Elara gripped the drive, the cold metal feeling more substantial than any legal brief she had ever filed. "I'm not looking for fair play anymore, Papa. I'm looking for the kill shot." She turned and walked back toward the elevator, the blue gown, now discarded for a black leather trench coat, left behind like a shed skin. The Moretti Accord was signed. She was no longer running from the ghost, she was the one directing his hand. The black drive Elara held was more than a storage device, it was a skeleton key to the world's most guarded basements. Within hours, she was submerged in the digital shadow, a sublayer of the internet where the Moretti Syndicate operated with surgical precision. She sat in a room bathed in the ultraviolet glow of tiered monitors, flanked by two of her father's most trusted specialists, Kale, a ghost hacker who could bypass biometric locks in his sleep, and Sophia, a forensic accountant who tracked money through the blockchain like a bloodhound on a fresh trail. "The Sterlings don't just hide money, Elara," Sophia murmured, her fingers dancing across a keyboard as streams of red and green data scrolled past. They camouflage it. They use a technique called layering, moving funds through dozens of shell companies in jurisdictions that don't even have extradition treaties. But they made one mistake. Elara leaned in, her eyes reflecting the flickering code. What mistake? They trust their own arrogance, Kale answered, tapping a screen to bring up a complex map of international server nodes. They use a proprietary encryption for their black books, the digital ledgers where they record the real bribes, the data racketeering, and the payoffs. It's a custom build they think is unbreakable because they paid $50 million for it. But it's based on an old military protocol I helped write 8 years ago. The air in the room felt electric. This was the intellectual heist her father had promised. As Kale's programs ate through the Sterling firewalls, Sophia began to piece together the narrative of a decades-long criminal enterprise. They weren't just looking at numbers, they were looking at lives ruined. They found records of the Sterling's short-selling companies they had intentionally sabotaged through data leaks, and evidence of donations to judges that coincided perfectly with favorable rulings. Look at this, Elara whispered, pointing to a recurring encrypted outgoing payment labeled Project 09. It wasn't going to a bank, it was going to a private security firm specializing in digital sanitation. They're paying someone to keep something dead, Kale noted, his brow furrowed as he initiated a brute force decryption on the Project 09 files. It's buried under 4 layers of deadman switches. If we trip one, the data wipes itself and alerts Alistair Sterling's personal security. Don't trip them, Elara commanded, her voice like ice. We don't just want the money trail. We need the smoking gun. We need the evidence that turns Julian's accident at the gala into a footnote in the Sterling family's obituary. For 36 hours, they lived in the hum of the cooling fans and the glow of the screens. Elara directed the search with the focus of a grandmaster, using her own knowledge of software architecture to predict where the Sterlings would hide their most damaging secrets. She saw the digital fingerprints of Julian Sterling all over the data racketeering logs. He wasn't just a spoiled heir, he was the primary architect of their most aggressive market manipulations. Finally, a soft chime echoed through the room. Kale's screen turned a deep, bruised purple. We're in. Project 09 isn't a business deal, Elara. It's a graveyard. A list of files appeared, each one a record of a suppressed police report, a paid-off witness, or a scrubbed traffic camera feed. As Elara scrolled through the names, her breath caught. She saw a date from 5 years ago, a night the city's media had reported as a tragic, unsolved hit-and-run involving a young local hero. The Sterlings didn't just pour wine on me because they thought I was a nobody, Elara realized, the coldness in her chest expanding. They did it because they're addicted to the feeling of being untouchable. They think they can erase anything. She looked at the screen, where the black books of the Sterling Empire lay bare. The digital shadow had yielded its secrets. She now had the keys to their kingdom, and more importantly, the map to the bodies they had buried beneath it. Copy everything, Elara said, her voice a low, lethal promise. Then find me the name of the man Julian killed. The file that materialized on the screen felt heavier than the millions of dollars in embezzled funds they had already uncovered. It was a digital ghost, a fragment of reality that Alistair Sterling had spent 5 years and 7 figures to incinerate. As Elara stared at the pixelated timestamp, she realized she wasn't just looking at data, she was looking at a murder. The victim was Elara Vance, Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the name. Elara's breath hitched. Vance? That's the name I took. He was a young teacher, Kale added, his fingers flying across the keys to stabilize a corrupted video file. A local hero who worked with underprivileged kids. On a rainy Tuesday 5 years ago, he was crossing Fifth Avenue when a silver Maserati Gran Turismo blew through a red light at 90 miles per hour. He never stood a chance. The video flickered to life. It was a feed from a private security camera that had been missed by the Sterling's initial sweep of the neighborhood. The footage was grainy, but the sequence was unmistakable. The sleek car struck the man, paused for a fraction of a second, and then accelerated into the darkness. "Zoom in on the driver's side," Elara commanded, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, cold fury. As the image sharpened, the face of Julian Sterling was illuminated by a flash of lightning. He didn't look horrified, he looked annoyed. He looked like a man who had just hit a pothole. "Wait," Sophia said, pulling up a secondary document. "Here is the payout." $10 million moved from a Sterling shell company to the then district attorney and 3 technicians at the city's traffic control center. Within 12 hours, the police report was lost, the car was crushed for scrap in a facility owned by Moretti's rival, and Leo Vance's death was reclassified as an accidental fall from a sidewalk. Elara looked at the photo of Leo Vance, a man with a kind smile and eyes full of hope, and then back at the video of Julian's cold, retreating taillights. She had chosen the name Vance because it sounded unremarkable, a way to blend into the professional world. Now, she realized it was a haunting irony. She had spent a decade trying to be a person who didn't exist, while the Sterlings had erased a man who truly did. "They didn't just kill him," Elara said, her hand reaching out to touch the screen. "They stole his legacy. They made it like he never mattered. They thought they could rewrite the world because they owned the ink." "Elara," Cale cautioned, pointing to a blinking red light on his console. "The data handshake is becoming unstable. We've been in their deepest archive for too long. If we don't pull out now, Alistair's personal security will trace the ping back to this warehouse." "Get the raw file of the hit and run," Elara ordered, not taking her eyes off the footage. "Get the bank transfer records to the DA and the metadata of the deleted police reports. I want every signature, every timestamp, every digital fingerprint." As the download bar crawled toward 100%, Elara felt a transformation. The last of her idealism, the belief that the legitimate world was fundamentally different from her father's, finally dissolved. The Sterlings weren't just bullies, they were a cancer on the city, protected by the very laws they pretended to uphold. "Download complete," Cale exhaled, pulling the drive. Elara gripped the small piece of plastic. It was the ghost of Fifth Avenue, the truth that would bridge the gap between her father's vengeance and her own justice. Julian Sterling had poured a drink on her to prove he was untouchable. He had no idea that he had just handed the daughter of the ghost the one thing he couldn't buy his way out of. "Tonight, Leo Vance gets his name back," Elara whispered. "And the Sterlings lose everything." The digital war room hummed with a low, predatory energy. Outside, the city slept, unaware that the foundations of its most powerful dynasty were about to be liquidated. Elara stood before a primary terminal, the blue light reflecting in her eyes like a frozen sea. On the screen, a single glowing button waited, the culmination of Moretti intelligence and her own righteous fury. "Everything is synchronized," Cale reported, his voice tight with the thrill of the hunt. "We've bypassed the Sterling-owned servers. The moment you hit send, the firewall at the Department of Justice will be flooded. Simultaneously, the encryption on the global news wire will drop. They won't have time to buy a gag order. They won't even have time to call their lawyers." Elara looked at the dossier, titled simply "The Sterling Legacy." It wasn't just a collection of files, it was a devastating narrative. It contained the raw footage of Julian's hit and run, the bank transfers to the disgraced district attorney, the forensic evidence of data racketeering, and the digital proof of the frame job used against Aegis software. It was a masterpiece of exposure. "Wait," Sophia said, her eyes fixed on a secondary monitor. "Alistair Sterling just logged into an encrypted satellite phone from his penthouse. He's calling his private airfield." He knows something is coming. Let him call, Elara said, her hand hovering over the keyboard. The higher they are, the harder the impact. He thinks he's escaping a storm. He doesn't realize the sky is falling. She thought of the wine soaking into her gown, the laughter of Beatrice Sterling, and the smug, untouchable grin on Julian's face. She thought of Leo Vance, a man whose life had been reduced to a line of deleted code. The Sterlings believed that money could rewrite reality, that power was the ability to silence the truth. They were about to learn that in the digital shadow, truth was the only currency that never devalued. Do it, Elara commanded. Her finger descended. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, the monitors erupted into a frenzy of activity. Thousands of packets of data surged through the fiber optic veins of the city. At the FBI's cybercrime division, alarms began to blare as the unbribable evidence hit their mainframes. At the headquarters of every major news network from New York to London, the Sterling dossier appeared on every editor's screen, bypass encrypted so it couldn't be deleted. The leak is global, Sophia whispered, her face illuminated by the scrolling confirmation logs. Interpol has flagged the international accounts. The SEC has just frozen the Sterling Group's trading floor. It's a total blackout. On a wall-mounted television, a late-night news anchor suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His earpiece crackled, and his face went pale. We are receiving breaking news. A massive cache of documents has just been released, alleging a decades-long criminal conspiracy involving the Sterling family. Details are emerging of a covered-up fatal hit-and-run and systemic market manipulation. Elara watched as the ticker at the bottom of the screen began to scroll with the crimes she had uncovered. The glass wall hadn't just been cracked, it had been pulverized. Across the street, the lights in the Sterling Tower began to flicker as panicked employees realized the ship was sinking. They're trying to scramble their private security, Cale noted, but their credit lines are being cut in real time. The empire is officially bankrupt of trust. Elara stepped back from the terminal, the cold weight in her chest finally beginning to lift. She had used her father's tools, but she had used them to execute a sentence the law was too weak to carry out. The midnight leak was a ghost story come to life, the moment the past finally caught up with the people who thought they could outrun it. Tell my father the debt is being collected, Elara said to the shadows. And get the car ready. I want to see the look on Julian's face when the feds reach the penthouse. The sirens did not start until the Sterlings reached the private airfield, a tactical delay orchestrated by Elara to ensure there would be no high-speed chase through city streets, only a cornered predator with nowhere left to run. Alastair Sterling hurried across the rain-slicked tarmac, his expensive leather loafers splashing through puddles. Behind him, Beatrice clutched a designer vanity case as if it contained her very soul, while Julian followed, his face a mask of pale, frantic confusion. The Gulfstream jet sat idling, its turbines whining like a wounded beast, the stairs down and inviting. Just get us in the air, Alastair barked at the pilot standing by the hatch. I don't care about flight plans. File them from 30,000 feet. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Sterling. The voice didn't come from the pilot. It came from the perimeter. Suddenly, the darkness of the airfield was shattered by the blinding, strobing glare of red and blue. A dozen black SUVs crested the rise, their tires screaming as they formed a semicircle around the aircraft. Alastair froze, his hand on the railing. Julian spun around, his eyes wide with the realization that the world he had bought and sold had finally turned its back on him. Alastair Sterling. Julian Sterling. Step away from the aircraft with your hands visible. The command came over a megaphone, amplified and echoing against the hangar walls. The media, tipped off by the same ghost protocols that had leaked the dossier, were already there. News helicopters hovered overhead like giant mechanical insects, their searchlights pinning the family to the tarmac like specimens on a board. On the edge of the light, Elara stepped out of a sleek black sedan. She didn't wear the ruined blue gown or the charcoal business suit. She wore a simple black coat, her blonde hair caught in the wind, looking like the very image of the vengeance she had summoned. She watched as federal agents swarmed the tarmac. They didn't move with the hesitation of the local police, they moved with the weight of a global mandate. Agent Miller, the man who had raided Elara's office just 24 hours ago, approached Julian. This time, Miller wasn't smirking. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for the second-degree murder of Leo Vance, the tampering of evidence, and multiple counts of securities fraud," Miller recited, his voice carrying clearly over the live news feeds broadcasting to millions. "This is a mistake." Beatrice shrieked as an agent took her vanity case and snapped zip ties around her wrists. "Do you know who we are?" "We know exactly who you are, Mrs. Sterling," the agent replied coldly. "That's the problem." Julian was forced to his knees. The camera from the lead news chopper zoomed in, capturing the moment his face hit the wet asphalt, the same asphalt Leo Vance had died on 5 years ago. He looked small. He looked terrified. The arrogance that had allowed him to pour a drink on a nobody had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, breaking boy. Alistair looked across the tarmac and locked eyes with Elara. For a moment, the mask of the billionaire patriarch slipped, revealing the raw, ugly fear of a man who realized his money was now just paper. He saw the daughter of the ghost standing in the light, and he knew that this wasn't just a legal arrest. It was a total erasure. As the agents loaded the Sterlings into the transport vans, the news anchors began a live play-by-play of the family's fall. The Sterling Group stock was hitting zero. Their properties were being seized. Their names were being scrubbed from the boards of every charity and museum in the city. Elara watched the tail lights of the federal convoy fade into the night. She didn't feel the rush of heat she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet stillness. The Sterlings had tried to use the law as a shield for their crimes, she had used the truth as a sword to shatter that shield. She turned back to her car, where her father sat in the shadowed back seat, watching the monitors. "It's over, Papa," she said. "No, Elara," Dominic replied, his voice a low, proud rumble. "The destruction is over. Now comes the part they never expected from a Moretti. Now, you build." The Grand Horizon Ballroom was bathed in a light that felt different than it had a year ago. It was no longer the harsh, judgmental gold of the Sterling's reign, but a soft, inclusive amber that seemed to warm the soul. The marble floors, once the site of Elara's greatest public shame, were now crowded with people whose stories didn't begin with trust funds, but with survival. Elara stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the gala she had organized to launch the Moretti Foundation for Ethical Tech. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, a color of growth and renewal, that moved with a quiet, regal fluidity. There was no wine dripping from her hair tonight, only the subtle shimmer of the same diamond earrings she had worn when the world thought she was a nobody. Beside her stood the board of her new foundation, former investigative journalists, whistleblowers who had been blacklisted by corporate giants, and technical geniuses who had once operated in the shadows. They were the architects of a new kind of power, one that used the syndicate's old efficiency to protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. "The room looks different when you're the one holding the door open," a voice rumbled from behind her. Elara turned to see Dominic Moretti. For the first time in his life, the ghost was attending a public event without a tactical plan or a target list. He looked at the diverse crowd, the families of victims like Leo Vance, now supported by scholarships and legal aid, and then back at his daughter. "You didn't just ruin them, Elara," Dominic said, a rare, genuine softness in his gray eyes. "You repurposed the wreckage." You took the Sterling's seized assets and turned their greed into a garden. That is a victory I never could have imagined. I learned from two very different educations, Papa, Elara replied, taking his arm as they began to descend the grand staircase. You taught me how to survive the dark. The Sterlings taught me how to recognize the rod and the light. This foundation is the bridge between the two. As they reached the floor, the room fell into a respectful silence. Elara stepped onto the small stage, the very spot where Julian Sterling had once stood with a crystal glass and a heart full of malice. She didn't look for a camera, she looked at the people. A year ago, a choice was made in this room to try and erase a human being's dignity, Elara said, her voice clear and unwavering, carrying to every corner of the hall. They thought power was the ability to silence others. They were wrong. True power is the choice to transform pain into purpose. It's taking the tools you're given, no matter where they came from, and building something that ensures no one else has to stand in the dark alone. She gestured to a portrait prominently displayed near the entrance, Elara Vance. He was no longer a deleted file or a forgotten tragedy. He was the face of the Foundation's first initiative, a symbol of a name restored and a debt of justice paid in full. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of the elite, it was the roar of a community that had seen the impossible happen. In the back of the room, Sophia and Cale raised their glasses to her, not in a toast to a mafia princess, but to a leader who had mastered the digital shadow to bring about a brighter day. As the music began to play, Elara stepped off the stage and walked toward the terrace. She stood in the exact spot where the wine had once pattered onto the floor. She looked out at the city skyline, where the Sterling Tower was now a community housing complex, its glowing logo replaced by a simple, steady light. She was no longer running from the ghost, and she was no longer a prisoner of the light. She was Elara Vance, the woman who had built an empire on the one rule the world could finally respect: the truth is the only thing that cannot be poured away. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.